Another very useful relationship is what I call the carbonate buffering equation. The carbonate buffering equation. We'll talk about buffering a little bit later, but this is a very useful equation that you may use a lot in geochemistry. If you forget everything about the calcium carbonate system or the CO2 H2O system, I want you to remember this equation, because you can use this equation in a lot of different examples, and it can be very useful to understand the precipitation and dissolution of calcium carbonate in a specific system. What is that? It's nothing else than, I wrote it this way here, like that is pretty clear, but it's nothing else than taking a rock, for example, solid, calcium carbonate, and you're exposing that to water plus CO2 that will give you this famous carbonic acid. And this is an acid, and that will lead to the dissolution of this solid calcium carbonate to form 2 bicarbonate plus some free calcium. So this is an equilibrium. This is not a strong acid, it's a weak acid. So this relationship will go back and forth. You can either way see that as the precipitation of calcium carbonate or the dissolution of calcium carbonate. Why it is what I think this equation can be very, very useful. It is just because when you think about the dynamic of the CO2 in this equation, okay? What will happen in this equation if I'm having a certain equilibrium with a certain amount of calcium carbonate here and certain amount of bicarbonate and carbonic acid in solution, when I'm adding more CO2 in the system? I'm pumping CO2 in the system, dissolving more CO2 in your system. That means you're increasing this CO2, that means you're increasing this part here. And if you know now that if you're increasing one side of an equation, Le Chatelier principle will move the equilibrium toward the opposite side of the equation. Meaning, if you're putting more CO2 on the reactant side, the reaction will go toward from a thermodynamic point of view, toward the product side. So you will dissolve calcium carbonate and produce bicarbonate. If you're doing the opposite way, if you're pumping CO2 out of your system, you're degassing CO2, you're removing CO2 from your water, that means that in this case you have less element on the left side on the reactant side. That means you will shift the equation from the product side toward the reactant side and favor this reaction here, meaning precipitation of calcium carbonate. So you can see any process that will retrieve, remove, uptake CO2 out of your system, remove the CO2, could lead to precipitation of calcium carbonate, and any process that is increasing the PCO2, increasing the dissolution of CO2 in your environment, will lead to dissolution. That's a very useful environment to understand specific deposit in the lithosphere, and I will give you the first example, which is a travertine system. What is a travertine system? It's a pure physico-chemical process, and I listed a couple of key point in the definition of a travertine. This is a continental carbonate deposit. It's made out of calcium carbonate related to a chemical precipitation. It's nothing biological in the process of precipitation. The precipitation can take place on organic substrate, on plants, on bacteria, on anything, on wood. But the process leading to the precipitation is purely physico-chemical. Formation that is observed in spring, river, and lakes is built of aragonite and or calcite, mostly calcite. And a few detail about it's a very weak intracrystalline porosity, but a very strong structural and moldic porosity, because most of the time this precipitation is taking place in a river or lake when you have a lot of organism, a lot of flora, moss, algae, other plants, and this will lead to a lot of porosity. But in terms of small scale, micro scale, the crystals are pretty dense. And the precipitation is related to the degassing of CO2, exactly what is happening here. So let's have an example and make a small drawing to explain how a travertine can actually form. So what we have is, first, I'm going to draw a mountain here with the slope. It's going to be in cross section here, and then here we'll have a nice little slope. So it's if like you cutting through a mountain, and it is a calcium carbonate mountain. So the symbol for calcium carbonate is this typical marble-like structure, wall structure we have seen, I'm sure, in some geological representation of a limestone deposit. So that is interesting. Cross-section through a limestone mountain or whatever you want. And here what you have is, we're going to simplify that, you're going to have here some soil with some trees, some vegetation here, okay, and here what you have is some cloud. It's not to scale, of course. Those clouds, you will have rain. You remember that the pH of the rainwater is around 6.6 for the pH. This water will be found inside the soil, in the groundwater. Inside the soil it will pick up some decomposition of organic matter, more CO2. We see that, the decomposition of organic matter, we already saw that. The result of the respiration is organic matter, okay, organic matter plus oxygen. That will give you CO2 plus H2O. That's the reverse of a photosynthesis. That's this respiration processes, respiration. Inside the soil, the decomposition of the organic matter falling from the trees and different flora in the forest or in the environments. So you're increasing CO2 into your water. So the PCO2 in here can be pretty high. So that means this will slowly dissolve the calcium carbonate because the water will be acidic. More CO2, more carbonic acid. That means you can dissolve calcium carbonate. In this case, remember, when I'm having this equation, let's write it the right way. CaCO3 plus CO2 plus water will give you 2HCO3 minus plus Ca2 plus. So what I'm doing here, I'm putting more CO2 in your water, creating more carbonic acid, you're dissolving and you're forming more bicarbonate. So you're dissolving the solid here. So in this case, you're going to start by dissolving the limestone little and creating some network, sometimes some cave. Here, dissolution of things all the way, and this is what we call a karst. Dissolution of a limestone. You have a lot of feature associated to karst. No stalagmite, stalactite, caves. This water will percolate and dissolve more and more this limestone here, and because the temperature may drop, this is a certain temperature here, and the pressure is the same, or pressure is atmospheric pressure, and maybe the pressure can be increasing a little bit. That means the water, remember the constant of Henry, can hold more CO2. You can even actually dissolve more CO2 into your water. That means it's getting even more acidic, and dissolve even more calcium carbonate. So this is what is happening here. Then, for example, what you may have is a kind of layer of clay or marls, not only calcium carbonate, let's say it's marls. Marls is a mixture of calcium carbonate and clay minerals that is impermeable to water. So the water will then reach this level after dissolving things here and not going through this level because this is not going to be dissolved by the water. Clay minerals are not sensitive to this acidity. So the water will then follow these impermeable layers and flow and come out, forming a spring. And this spring will flow along this relief here and go on. At this point here, the water will equilibrate with the atmosphere. Let's write it the right way here. With equilibrium with the atmosphere, because the pressure will be lower and the temperature will be increasing. That means that all this CO2, the PCO2 that here is very high, this water cannot hold this PCO2 anymore. So this will lead to CO2 degassing. And equilibration over a certain amount of time here. Degassing. So that means you're going to remove this CO2 out of this equation, shift the equilibrium toward the left, and precipitate calcium carbonate. So you may have at the end, down there, precipitation of calcium carbonate in your stream called a travertine. And this is what is a travertine. So you understand that the mechanism, the engine of precipitation is purely physico-chemical. So then if you have a tree, a piece of leaf or wood or your hand, it will be encrusted by calcium carbonate. And that will give you a travertine deposit. And this is the main mechanism of creating a travertine. So there's two main kinds of travertine. One is the meteogene, the one I just explained just before. It's because the CO2 is coming from the atmosphere. What we call the thermogene travertine, the CO2 is coming from hydrothermal origin through the decarbonatation or heated organic matter, decomposition of organic matter. So the source of the CO2 is important, but the mechanism is the same. When this CO2 is reaching the atmosphere, you will have degassing of your CO2. And this is an example of, in France, of the Rivière La Loup, of the similar system I just draw on the board right now. It's you'll see in literature some people are calling tufa and travertine different things, using tufa for cold water and travertine for the warm water system. I like the definition by Pencos et al. 2005 in a book called Travertine. If you are interested in travertine, I advise you to read this book. It's Pencos 2005 about travertine. In his simplifying the process, is a very good book about travertine. But you'll see in literature you will have people separating different type of denomination word for different style of precipitation. But the mechanism behind that, travertine or tufa, is the same. It's degassing of CO2. So you see here, this is a calcium carbonate. You see those bed of calcium carbonate, and here you have the water coming out of this mountain here. Let's do that. You go here, and if you go a little bit further, you see that the entire mountain here, this made a little bit moldy moss, is covered by calcium carbonate precipitation, and you see here the water flowing on the left. So the water is percolating through these cracks here, and the degassing leading to the precipitation of travertine in yellow. In this case, the calcium carbonate is encrusting some moss and other plants that are actually living in this stream. And that's another example here. And the cool thing is, just beside this one, we can actually find some older travertine. This one is close to 10,000 years old. And you see that it's fossilizing everything. You have here pine cone, you have pine needle. So this was a different climate between this and this. This was way drier, less humidity, maybe colder because you have more pine tree here and you have more phanerogram in this case on the right. So travertine can be very useful to study because the system is preserving everything, preserving the fossils by precipitating things, but also pollen, spore, other biomarker or environmental marker to rebuild your ecosystem. You can have a similar system in warm water system. This is another system in Italy, in Tuscany, when in this case what we have is water. Let's have another color, a mountain here and here, the same, but the difference is you don't have a karst, but what you have is a chamber, magma chamber here, warm, and you have a hydrothermal system with water percolating through the system, getting warm and dissolving a lot of lithosphere and element CO2 into the lithosphere and getting out and creating a stream. So this is the warming effect and dissolution here, charging your CO2. So in this case, the main factor is pressure rather than temperature. So you will put a lot of CO2 to the contact to this magma chamber here. And this is the same system here. At this point, you're going to degas CO2. And you're forming pools of water. Here, beautiful pool of water. And people can actually bath inside those pools. This is warm water. This is a hydrothermal system. And this can lead to the formation of piezoids, typical round shape, around 2 to 3 1 to 2 centimeter in diameter. And if you're cutting that, you can see the precipitation of calcium carbonate in ring, concentric ring of elements turning to occurrence. You may ask why you forming actually those pool. Here you have clearly some pool here, and not just a continuous crust of calcium carbonate. So if you think about the system I just drew, you have this mountain, and now let's do that a little bit better. You have this mountain with some relief here. Okay, so it's not a flat linear relief. And you have your water percolating, getting close to the magma chamber here. I wanted to have this here. So this water will warm up and then will come out, form a spring, and the gas already here. But it will take a little bit of time to cool down and to equilibrate with the atmosphere. So you will degas CO2 all over the profile here. And if you see, the degassing will be also proportional to the speed, to the velocity of the current. And if you are taking a color of this to show, or let's take yellow to precipitate. In any case, here, when you have a sharper slope, the speed will be higher. Here, here, or here. So here you will have more degassing than here, when it's flat. So when the speed is higher, meaning here, here, and here, you may have more precipitation. You start to build up more precipitation here. And as you're growing, I'm going to increase the magnification here. So you will have something like that. Let's have the white. something like that, you will slowly precipitate calcium carbonate here and then here, and you will increase the slope, meaning the turbulence, and you will create some kind of small platform of preferential degassing of CO2 in these environments, leaving behind a nice little pool of water. And this is how you're creating your pool of water, because in those regions here, let's put in red, in those regions here, you have more degassing than in flatter area like that here. So you will start to build those typical pool. So it's a mixture of the topography and the degassing process of the CO2. Every process that is uptaking CO2 out of the system is potentially could lead to precipitation of calcium carbonate. We have seen the example of travertine, which was a pure physico-chemical precipitation. But what about life? Life can also be responsible for a highly dynamic CO2 cycle, or carbon cycle if you want. You're not going to cycle CO2, you're cycling carbon, of course. But in terms of uptake and degassing of CO2, life can actually play an important role. You know that we are doing respiration. That means we are taking organic matter plus oxygen, and we are producing CO2 plus H2O. Okay, so that is our basic metabolism. We are breathing oxygen. This oxygen is used to oxidize. We'll see oxidation reduction next chapter, but you may already know that. Oxidize organic matter. The oxidation of organic matter will lead to the oxidized carbon source, which is CO2, that we will release in our environments, and the oxygen will be reduced and forming water. So this process will increase CO2 in the atmosphere, in the environment. 3, 2, 1. Every process that is uptaking CO2 out of the system is potentially could lead to precipitation of calcium carbonate. We have seen the example of travertine, which was a pure physico-chemical precipitation. But what about life? Life can also be responsible for a highly dynamic CO2 cycle, or carbon cycle if you want. You're not going to cycle CO2, you're cycling carbon, of course. But in terms of uptake and degassing of CO2, life can actually play an important role. You know that we are doing respiration. That means we are taking organic matter plus oxygen, and we are producing CO2 plus H2O. Okay, so that is our basic metabolism. We are breathing oxygen. This oxygen is used to oxidize. We'll see oxidation reduction next chapter, but you may already know that. Oxidize organic matter. The oxidation of organic matter will lead to the oxidized carbon source, which is CO2, that we will release in our environments, and the oxygen will be reduced and forming water. So this process will increase CO2 in the atmosphere, in the environments, meaning if you have a breathing organism inside the water, that will increase CO2 and maybe lead to dissolution of calcium carbonate. But for example, plants or some bacteria are able to do what we call photosynthesis. We'll talk about that in a few minutes when we talk about the carbon cycling. And it is, if I'm taking another color, the reversed process. Photosynthesis is a reverse process. You're taking CO2 plus water plus solar energy, and you're creating organic matter and O2. So forget about any detail. Just think and remember that photosynthesis, and you know that plants and some bacteria are taking CO2 to create biomass. That means taking CO2 out of what? Out of your surrounding, out of your water. So photosynthesis should lead to precipitation of calcium carbonate. You have evidence in some algae calcifying, but in very important example, very key example for the history of life and in geology is the cyanobacteria. Some bacteria are able to do photosynthesis. Those bacteria are cyanobacteria. We will talk about that a bit more in detail in the redox chapter or in other courses you will have at the university. But just know that they are able to do photosynthesis, and they are doing that. They're taking up CO2. And you can study those in a lot of different environments. You can have that in hypersaline lake, in marine environments, or in freshwater. I could have shown you a lot of different examples. I'm going to show you a very simple one that is in a freshwater in Switzerland, close to my hometown, in French part of Switzerland. And this is a nice little river here. And the water here is flowing, coming from a dam. There is a dam somewhere behind those trees here. And the water that is flowing on this river here is coming from the very deep part of this lake, because the lake is formed behind the dam, and when they're turbining to do the electricity, they're taking the water from the deeper part of the lake, and you know that the deeper part of a lake is always really cold, it's around 4 degrees Celsius. Then you're putting that in the river, in the stream. That means you're killing everything around because the water is really cold. All the algae are really not really happy with that. The fishes are not really happy with that also. And you're developing a microbial mat. And those microbial mats look like that. If I go back to that, yes, on the top of those rocks here, you will find a small little crust of cyanobacteria, algae, that is lithifying, precipitating calcium carbonate. And this is what you see. You see the top part of this. If you want, the surface of the rock was like that. And on the top of this rock, you will have this little crust that is like 2 millimeter, not even 1 or 2 millimeter in diameter. And you see that this, you can clearly see some mark like that and some lamination like that. So if you using a specific techniques in microscopy called scanning electron microscopy, and you freezing your samples, you are able to image at very high resolution the organic matter and the mineral product. There's a lot of other techniques to look at those samples using microscopy, but it involves that you need to dry the samples. Most of the SEM techniques, the scanning electron microscope, cannot have any water in it because you're observing your sample in a vacuum. And if you have water, the water will degas and you won't have any vacuum anymore. You will have water vapor in your system. So you won't be able to image your samples. That means those SEM need high vacuum. So one way to do that is to freeze and to keep this sample very, very cold so you can observe in 3D the structure of those samples. And this is what we can do. And this is what an image of one of those samples. And you can recognize filaments in green here. You see the cell here. Those are cyanobacteria, different cyanobacteria. You see this is a cell. This is some bigger cell. So you see the bundle of filamentous cyanobacteria. And in between, what you see, let's say in brown here, you see some crystal here. Here, here, here. This is calcium carbonate precipitation. So if I'm taking an increasing magnification of that here, I'm done with that. You can really clearly see in green the cyanobacteria and in orange the precipitation of calcium carbonate. So this is a parallel section through the growth of the crust. And if you take a perpendicular section, we have the same here. You have in green cyanobacteria, orange the calcium carbonate. green, and orange. So you see you have a clear and close relationship between the calcium carbonate and the bacteria itself. So how does it work? I don't want to go into detail, but it is an example where the CO2 uptake, so the bacteria is doing photosynthesis, taking CO2 out of the system and inducing precipitation of calcium carbonate. If you want to have a little bit more detail, I have a small model. You don't need to know that for the example. Just to show you that this is an excellent example of microbe-mineral interactions when microbes can actually precipitate calcium carbonate and form rocks due to their metabolism. If you have a small model, you can actually explain that this way. This is the atmosphere, this is the water, and this is a section through the bacteria. You see the cell here and the sheath. So CO2 from the atmosphere will be mixed into the water, and because the water is pH neutral here, most of the DIC will be under the form of bicarbonate. We just saw that in the previous lecture. So it will be mostly around bicarbonate. So this bicarbonate will be pumped into the cyanobacteria to do photosynthesis. The problem is cyanobacteria, to do photosynthesis, cannot use bicarbonate. It's using CO2. The cyanobacteria have an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that will separate the CO2 from the OH. The CO2 will be used for photosynthesis, and the hydroxide will be released in the surrounding environments of the cyanobacteria and interact with the bicarbonate to form water and calcium and carbonate. If you have calcium in solution, you can precipitate calcium carbonate. So this is how you're precipitating the calcium carbonate around filamentous cyanobacteria, forming crust. And if you have season, you have different processes leading to lamination that can form what we call a stromatolite at the end. So that's just a nice little example to couple the carbonate, the CO2, water, and calcium system with the lithosphere, and how some pure physico-chemical processes like in travertine or some biological processes like in cyanobacteria can lead to the precipitation of rocks.